Okay, so let's talk now about some of the benefits of creatine. We've got number one benefit is muscle health. The increase of lean muscle mass, strength, and power, particularly beneficial for older adults to counteract sarcopenia. What is sarcopenia? It's age-related loss of muscle. So, we all hear the doctors tell you, oh, you're just getting older, you got to accept it. Not really. You don't have to accept it. Working out, supplementing with something like creatine will help preserve your muscle even as you age. We know that creatine can benefit us through cognitive function. It improves memory, attention, and reasoning, especially under sleep-deprived or stressful situations. And I'll show you some of the research on that in a moment. We know it offers neurological protection, shows promise in protecting against traumatic brain injuries. This is an area of science that if you've had a concussion, you ever hit your head really, really hard, or had a traumatic brain injury, the two things I recommend everyone with traumatic brain injury do as close to the injury as possible is, number one, is get creatine in you. And then number two is get omega-3, high doses, 6 to 8 or more grams per day of omega, and then here 20 grams a day, as close to that injury as possible. There's research showing tremendous benefit there. So again, traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injuries. One of the effects is it reduces oxidative damage, it reduces inflammation, and I'll show you that mechanism here shortly. Bone health. We know it supports healthy bone mineral density by stimulating bone cell activity. Cardiometabolic health, improves glucose tolerance and may lower risk factors for metabolic syndrome. I just showed you a moment ago how creatine helps upregulate the production of the doorway on your cells that allows glucose to come in and make energy. We know it's important for exercise recovery, reduces muscle damage, soreness, and inflammation post-exercise, but also aids in your recovery. So a lot of potential benefit there for creatine. Let's talk about some mechanisms. So blow this up. This is it's a diagram published in the journal Nutrients on the mitochondria functions with creatine and without creatine under damage. So if you look here, you'll see injury, contusion, or infarction. In essence, trauma, right? Trauma to the cells. And so what happens when you have an injury, contusion, infarction is you get changes in the cell, in the mitochondria. These changes here are represented by these red circles. So you get increased glutamate neurotoxicity. Glutamate floods into that tissue and can create a neurotoxicity effect. We get lowered ATP, that's energy. When the cell makes less energy, it doesn't heal as well. It's not as efficient in healing and repair. We get reduced oxidative respiration. What does that mean? Oxidative respiration is the process by which we make energy. So again, reduced energy. We also get an increased production of this chemical called lactate. This is where some of that pain comes from the injury, is that lactate, lactic acid buildup. We also get increases in ROS. That stands for reactive oxygen. These are free radicals. You've heard that term before. Maybe just didn't know exactly what it meant, but ROS is free radical. That leads to oxidative stress. That leads to cell damage. That leads to pain as well. And this is, again, this is the inflammation right here. So this is injury, contusion, infarction. Now, this is a normal cell with no extra creatine. This is a cell with creatine. And so you can see the green lines showing the impact or the effect of creatine. So you have the same damage that occurs here, but now with creatine, it preserves the influx of glutamate causing neurotoxicity. So it reduces that from happening. We know that creatine increases the cellular energy production. We know it reduces the formation of free radicals. We know that it reduces the lactate production, which is what caused that pain. And so it also reduces the quantity of cell damage that occurs. So we have inflammation. We still have inflammation because there's injury, but we have less of it. and we have faster recovery. And so that's one of the mechanisms of how creatine impacts your mitochondria, because this is your mitochondria that we're talking about here, and in cellular damage. So a couple of research studies down here where this diagram is based from. And so you can see here, these are human studies on traumatic brain injury. Let's blow that up so you can see it a little bit better. So what do you have? You got 0.4 grams of creatine per kilogram per day for 6 months in these patients. So that's a pretty strong, pretty high dose. And you see improved their outcomes, improved self-care, improved cognition, improved behavior functions, and communication. These are in traumatic brain injury patients. Another study done by the same group on traumatic brain injury, same dose, 0.4 grams per kilogram per day for 6 months, reduced fatigue, reduced headache, and reduced dizziness. So if you've got traumatic brain injury, this is a potential for you. Talk to your doctor about high doses of creatine. That dose structure, again, is 0.4 grams per kilogram. I know that's not in pounds. A lot of you harp on me and ask me about pounds. You could do a simple calculator, but 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. So that's how you do the math, and you could take 2.2, if you take your weight, and you can determine what it is in pounds from kilograms or vice versa, and then, you can multiply that number, that 0.4 grams into kilograms. So if you're taking your weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2, your weight in pounds, if you're in the US, and you divide it by 2.2, that gives you kilograms, and then you multiply that number by 0.4, and that gives you the total quantity of creatine that you can take on a daily basis if you're in that type of a situation. Okay, let's talk about some of the other manifestations or benefits of creatine. So beyond the muscles, the untapped potential of creatine. This was published in the International Immunopharmacology Journal. And so you see here, because there's a significant pool of creatine in the brain, the utility of creatine supplementation has been examined in vitro as well as in vivo in both animal models of neurological disorders and in humans. While the data are preliminary, there's evidence to suggest that individuals with certain neurological conditions may benefit from exogenous, that means taking creatine, right? Not what you produce internally, that would be endogenous, this is exogenous. So from creatine supplementation, if treatment protocols can be optimized. A small number of studies that we have examined the impact of creatine on the immune system have shown an alteration in soluble mediator production and the expression of molecules involved in recognizing infections, especially TLR, toll-like receptors. Future investigations are necessary. So they kind of give you a visual diagram here of the benefit of creatine. So creatine helps by protecting nerves, neuroprotection. How does it do that? It reduces ROS. What did we say that was? That's free radicals. So it reduces free radicals, it increases ATP, and it increases the phosphocreatine pool. So remember, the phosphocreatine is what we want. That's the driver of energy. We know in the immune response, it downregulates what are called TLRs. TLR stands for toll-like receptor. These are receptors that will stimulate inflammation. So we know creatine helps to modulate that response down. So we get a reduced inflammation response. So it modulates the immune system from overreacting or overresponding. We also know there's benefits of creatine in the lung. And so there are a number of things that it helps to do. And so you can see here on the left, this diagram, airway hyperresponsiveness, smooth muscle thickness, elastic fibers increasing in collagen and eosinophils, interleukins 4 and 5. We know that over here, if you look here, it reduces ICAM1 and E-selectin. These are, ICAM is intracellular adhesion molecules. These are basically, it's just a fancy way of saying these are white blood cell products that come in and drive inflammation. And so creatine can help with that inflammation. So reducing inflammation in the immune system, in the nervous system, and in the lungs. We also know that there's a mechanism of creatine and leaky gut. So can see here that is a junction, a tight junction, if you will. These are the proteins that hold our gut cells together. When those proteins are dismantled, we get leakiness. And so then the poop and the ingredients in the poop can leak across your gut barrier into your bloodstream, creating mass systemic inflammatory responses. So we don't want that to happen, obviously. So what happens here is we know that creatine, if you look here, these are these proteins that seal the gut lining, but you have creatine kinase, that enzyme I was talking about earlier, is connected to that web of actomyosin, which is the protein that holds those tight junctions together. And so if you have increased level of phosphocreatine, you can generate more energy in the gut cells to stabilize and hold those gut cells together. Remember, those gut cells require energy to form tight junctions to prevent leakiness of gut cells. So this is one of the mechanisms of how creatine can actually be beneficial for many people, even with leaky gut. So you see cytosolic CK, that's cellular creatine kinase, that's that enzyme there, localizes to apical adherens junctions. What does that mean? Is it basically as it attaches to this protein here, okay, in complex with the cytoskeletal network, providing a conduit for rapid ATP generation. That just basically means for rapid energy production, okay, and so it helps the cell maintain its architecture and prevents it from leaking. So creatine and leaky gut. All right, there's another component I want to talk about here, and that is in the face of cancer and other metabolic diseases where there's something called the Warburg effect. I don't want to get too technical, but so I'm going to try to make this make sense. So when our bodies make energy, there's two mechanisms or two pathways whereby we can convert glucose into energy. One of those mechanisms is called oxidative phosphorylation. You've heard me talk about this a number of times, but this is when we have plenty of oxygen. This red circle here, that's oxygen. Because when we have plenty of oxygen, we use a process called oxidative phosphorylation to generate a whole lot of energy from sugar, from glucose. About 36 ATP are generated on this equation. Now, if we don't have enough oxygen, that's called anaerobic glycolysis. Now, whereas this over here is called aerobic. So if you've ever heard the term aerobics, and you go into gym class, you're talking about aerobics, that just basically means you're doing exercise where you don't run out of oxygen. You constantly have a supply of oxygen so you can make energy efficiently. You can get energy made efficiently when you have the presence of oxygen. So if you're doing aerobic exercise, the oxygen generally doesn't run out. But when you're doing anaerobic exercise, so this would be like jogging or stair climbing or something, classic aerobic activity, jumping up and down, moving about, whereas anaerobic is typically weightlifting. So this is like weight-bearing types of exercise. If you ever lifted weights and you felt that burn in your muscle, that burning is happening because you're making this chemical right here, this lactic acid, this lactate, because you don't have enough oxygen. So this is a much less efficient way to make energy. But when we don't have enough oxygen, it's what we do. And so you can see we only make 2 ATP in this process of anaerobic. Now, the benefit of creatine is that creatine supplementation helps us to make more ATP than that too. So we get more out of our production if we have adequate creatine saturation of our muscles, and that allows us to lift more weight or to lift weight longer. And this is why creatine has a muscle growth effect. In part, it is because it improves our energy capacity so we don't get the burning in our muscle quite as quickly. So again, this is anaerobic metabolism. So you've got aerobic metabolism, or what's known as oxidative phosphorylation, plenty of oxygen, makes lots of ATP. Then you have anaerobic, not enough oxygen, only 2 ATP are produced here, but creatine can enhance that. And then you have something called the Warburg effect. And the Warburg effect occurs when you have plenty of oxygen. You see you got the O here, that's oxygen. There's still plenty of oxygen, but the process of making energy is still producing lactic acid, which is causing an increased acidity in the cell, and it's less energy efficient. You get more than 2, but you only get 4. And this Warburg effect was initially identified by a Dr. Warburg in cancer cells. So this is one of the mechanisms of cancer cells. And so what the Warburg effect is what we're using glucose and we're fermenting glucose. So it's a different way to make the energy. Fermentation, when we ferment carbohydrates, a byproduct of that is also alcohol. But in this case, it's, you're fermenting the carbohydrate, even though there's plenty of oxygen. These are cancer cells. That's why when alternative doctors are treating cancer, what do they recommend? They recommend not eating sugar, like glucose, right? They recommend more kind of a ketogenic or a high-fat, high-protein diet. Why? Because we're trying to make energy there's a whole other way we make energy called beta oxidation. I know I'm going way too deep into biochemistry for you, probably a lot of you. But we can break down fat. We break down fat through a process called beta oxidation, and it doesn't have any of these consequences. It's a whole different mechanism of energy production. But this is why with cancer, they want you eating fat as your main source of energy so that you're not creating this lactic acid buildup in the cell, creating increased acidity. So all that to say this, creatine helps to reduce the acidic nature inside of cells, both cancer cells and in tissues going through anaerobic metabolism to generate energy. So it's another potential benefit for creatine to enhance energy production in the body to overcome potential pathology.